The transition from curiosity to catastrophe is never a thunderclap. It is a slow, rotting decay. In the heart of a Salem home, what began as a whisper of unease quickly metastasized into an invisible, suffocating dread that no prayer could silence. If you are watching this right now, I want to ask you something. How much of history do you think is actually true? Because what you are about to hear was never meant to reach you. These are the classified files, the buried evidence, and the forbidden stories that powerful forces spent decades trying to erase. If you are someone who refuses to accept the official story, you are in the right place. Subscribe to the Dark History Files and join thousands of truth seekers uncovering what history tried to hide. Welcome back. This is the Dark History Files, and today, we expose a truth that was never meant to be told. Within one Salem household, the rhythms of life persisted undisturbed. The rooms were humble, bathed in the dim glow of hearth fire and filtered through narrow panes. Family members moved through the familiar cadence of chores and prayers. Nothing in the dwelling's facade suggested it would soon become the epicenter of a harrowing ordeal. It remained an ordinary domestic space, defined by the quiet habits of the rural life. Then came the reports of unsettling phenomena. Strange cries pierced the domestic stillness. Erratic movements seized the attention of those struggling to comprehend what they witnessed. Concern displaced the rhythmic sounds of industry. The home's emotional fabric frayed. Voices trembled with instability. Footsteps quickened in the gloom. What had been predictable now bore an unfamiliar, suffocating tension that stretched from dawn deep into the night. As days eroded, the family sought clarity. Relatives scrutinized every incident, piecing together fragments of the inexplicable. They exhausted practical explanations first, for strange behavior did not immediately signal the supernatural. They monitored for illness, searching for patterns to ground the chaos. Yet the episodes persisted. Small observations mounted. Questions outpaced answers, shifting the household from mere surprise into a persistent, deepening state of dread. For those trapped in this crucible, the true burden was the void of understanding. When confronted with the inexplicable, the human mind instinctively claws for causes. Those in the house dwelled in the narrow space between observation and conclusion. They recognized the unfolding horror, yet lacked the language to name it. Before accusations surfaced and before names were cast into the public square, there existed this stifling moment of confusion, where uncertainty itself became the most dominant presence in the room. The initial disruptions within the household did not manifest as a sudden tempest. They arrived as a series of mounting anomalies. The family observed actions that defied reason. The girls fell into unprovoked distress, shattering the domestic calm. What appeared transient at first soon revealed a darker consistency. Alarm took root not from a solitary event, but from the relentless, repeating pattern of these incidents. Observers labored to articulate the nature of these phenomena. Reports described visceral outbursts, contorted movements, and expressions of genuine agony. The girls seemed to recoil from threats visible only to them. Their plight magnetized the attention of relatives and neighbors. Each witness brought their own predispositions to the scene, yet a consensus emerged. Something profound and aberrant was unfolding. Modern minds demand immediate medical diagnosis, yet Salem operated under a different paradigm. While physicians existed, their knowledge was tethered to the limits of the era. When conventional remedies failed, uncertainty swelled. This diagnostic void invited speculation. Where medicine could not define the malady, the community looked to other, less tangible realms for answers. Practical life within the home fractured. The demands of the household languished as energy shifted toward managing the crisis. Visitors swarmed to witness the disturbances, and discourse became obsessed with the origin of the affliction. The steady pulse of domestic routine faltered, displaced by an encroaching, unanswerable enigma that consumed the emotional bandwidth of all involved. This stage is defined by its ambiguity. The later machinery of accusations, trials, and public hysteria had yet to be forged. The household remained in a state of desperate inquiry, searching for cause rather than conviction. Fear was present, yet it wrestled with confusion and a fragile hope for a rational resolution. In this climate of silence and unanswered questions, the initial chapter of Salem's descent quietly began. As rumors of the girl's affliction escaped the household, the circle of observers expanded. In such a tight-knit community, the anomalous could not remain private. Whispers traversed doorways, village paths, and the social gatherings following worship. Details were sifted, compared, and debated. While some met these accounts with skepticism, others could not so easily dismiss them. The mystery escaped the confines of the family, becoming a communal preoccupation. Every observer brought their own lens to the events. A parent focused on the visceral distress of the youth. A neighbor weighed the behavior against half-remembered folk legends. The devout sought spiritual meaning where others chased clinical causes. These fractured viewpoints failed to yield consensus, instead forging a tapestry of competing impressions. As the audience grew, so did the interpretations surrounding the stricken home. The afflicted girls anchored this gathering storm of attention. Observers scrutinized them, desperate to find rhythm in the chaos. They logged the timing, duration, and triggers of every episode. Each fresh outbreak stoked further speculation. Mundane moments were subjected to forensic scrutiny, repurposed as potential clues. The quest for truth transformed simple human movements into fragments of a puzzle that defied any known solution. In this vacuum, uncertainty gained its own gravity. When rational answers fail, the mind searches relentlessly for any tether. Conversations drifted into possibilities once considered unthinkable. Ideas took root in the community, gaining influence simply because no compelling alternative existed. The lack of certainty allowed disparate theories to flourish side by side, each new discourse adding a layer of complexity to the unfolding narrative. In retrospect, this phase marked a distinct pivot. The ordeal was no longer a private tragedy, but a fixture of Salem's consciousness. Yet the path ahead remained obscured. Residents hovered in the perilous space between observation and conclusion, gathering evidence while struggling to decipher it. Before formal accusations ignited the community, there existed this somber period of inquiry, a time when the people watched, listened, and grappled for meaning within events that remained stubbornly beyond explanation. The search for answers drew in those tasked with healing the body. When symptoms defied common understanding, families naturally sought medical counsel. Observations were recorded and theories debated, yet the boundaries of 17th century medicine soon emerged. Many afflictions now understood by science remained shrouded in mystery. Physicians operated within the constraints of an era defined by fragments of knowledge. This impasse bred a profound sense of instability. The girl's distress appeared authentic to all witnesses, yet standard remedies offered no relief. When expectations of a cure collapsed, frustration hardened. The yearning for clarity intensified, precisely because the truth remained elusive. Consultations yielded no resolution, leaving the household adrift in doubt. Salem's broader worldview exacerbated this tension. Residents operated within a paradigm that blurred the lines between natural pathology and spiritual influence. When medical causes proved inadequate, it became logical to pivot toward alternatives. The inquiry transitioned from empirical observation to the realms of religious conviction and cultural expectation. Meanwhile, the rhythms of existence persisted. Fields were tilled, meals prepared, and prayers offered, yet all discourse inevitably gravitated toward the enigma. Each fresh detail fueled the village's collective preoccupation. The stark contrast between the banality of daily chores and the encroaching mystery amplified the perceived significance of the events. Routine offered the illusion of continuity, while uncertainty sowed disruption. This era exposes how confusion anchors a community long before a crisis peaks. No courtroom had yet distilled questions into formal accusations. No verdict of guilt had been rendered. Salem existed in a state of suspended concern. With medicine failing and religious interpretations ascending, the village balanced on a razor's edge. Uncertainty acquired a potent force, dictating the pulse of the community and quietly forging the conditions for a transformation that would soon propel this narrative far beyond the confines of a single home. As winter yielded to spring in 1692, the search for truth entered a volatile phase. Anomalies once confined to a private circle now commanded the attention of all Salem. Concern migrated from family hearths to the public square, transforming quiet household anxiety into a communal obsession. Questions that once lingered in shadows now permeated every conversation across the settlement. This surge in attention fundamentally altered the perception of reality. Incidents previously dismissed as trivial were subjected to intense scrutiny. Every detail attained significance, tethered to an encroaching mystery. Even those who had never witnessed the affliction directly constructed their own impressions from hearsay. Thus, the unfolding ordeal transcended immediate experience, embedding itself into the village's collective consciousness. Fear, too, underwent a dark metamorphosis. Initial empathy for the suffering youth mutated into a broader, pervasive dread. With the cause obscured, the community grew haunted by the possibility of contagion. Anxiety flourished not because of what was known, but because the truth remained unreachable. In the absence of clarity, the populace searched for explanations in increasingly desperate directions. Yet, a fragile hope for normalcy persisted. The village had not yet succumbed to the era of infamy. Fields were tilled, livestock tended, and prayers offered in the meeting house. Ordinary existence mirrored growing panic, a contrast that reveals the insidious nature of historical crises. They do not descend with sudden force, but weave themselves into the fabric of life until the mundane and the monstrous become one. Standing at this juncture, Salem remains suspended in a state of perilous ambiguity. Initial reports have been logged. Observations have been exchanged. Medical science has faltered. The future remains a blank slate, invisible to those enduring it. They know only that the rhythm of their lives has been irrevocably disrupted. Within this void, the scaffolding of tragedy is rising, constructed not of evidence, but of questions that defy resolution. The sharp, rhythmic scratching of unseen fingers against the interior walls grows louder and faster, then stops abruptly, leaving behind a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight crushing the breath out of the room. The first accusations surfaced in a community bound by lifelong acquaintance. Homes lined familiar paths, and daily life mandated constant interaction. Neighbors traded goods, worshipped together, and exchanged news. Yet, within this intimacy, specific individuals became the focus of scrutiny. Their names drifted into conversations regarding the disturbances, shifting the focus from abstract mystery to targeted, personal concern. The climate surrounding these initial charges possessed a jarring emotional weight. Discourse that previously addressed the harvest or the weather now bristled with uneasy speculation. When names were invoked, curiosity tangled with apprehension. The mundane hum of village life persisted, but beneath it flowed a growing recognition that communal bonds were fraying. Information spread through an undercurrent of tension, defined as much by anticipation as by tangible evidence. As discourse accelerated, the mystery of the affliction yielded to the question of culpability. The focus transitioned from what was occurring to who might be responsible. This shift was not sudden. It crystallized through repetitive dialogue and interpretations fueled by deep-seated belief. With every exchange, suspicion solidified. The hunt for answers increasingly targeted individuals, marking a decisive transformation in the community's mindset. For those involved, an accusation held consequences far exceeding the reach of proof. A person's reputation was a complex architecture of history and perception. Once a name was tethered to suspicion, that reputation began to erode. Trust and terror collided. Before courtrooms and formal mandates, there existed this quiet, devastating phase where the mere whisper of guilt entered public discourse, irrevocably altering how neighbors perceived one another. The first names linked to the disturbances occupied varied stations within Salem. Some were well-known figures. Others existed on the periphery, connected by proximity, yet held at arm's length. When suspicion sought targets, existing prejudices guided its aim. Those already deemed unconventional or inscrutable faced far greater scrutiny than those who mirrored the village's rigid expectations. Reputation dictated interpretation. Every community harbors enduring narratives about its residents, tales of generosity, defiance, or long-standing conflict. Though these labels often distorted reality, they provided the framework through which accusations were processed. Evidence that might have been disregarded in a neutral context became damning when attached to someone already viewed through a lens of doubt. Conversations were the engines of this transformation. News cascaded through homes and meeting houses, with each retelling evolving as listeners layered in personal grievances, ancient memories, or hearsay. Information never remained static. It was distilled through human perception, accumulating emotional weight and baseless assumption with every exchange. The accused faced immediate isolation. A mere hint of suspicion fractured the social contract. Neighbors who once traded greetings now moved with caution, their interactions thick with unvoiced questions. Trust became a casualty of the mounting uncertainty, plaguing both the accuser and the accused. The bedrock of community stability began to crack. This phase remains critical, as many residents were still seeking answers rather than fueling a collapse. The future was not yet written. Some believed the chaos would naturally subside. Others were increasingly convinced of a dark, hidden agency. Salem balanced on a razor's edge between skepticism and conviction. While the village adhered to its rhythmic routines, an invisible metamorphosis was underway, irreversibly poisoning the way neighbors looked at one another. As accusations propagated, suspicion traversed Salem not as a formal inquiry, but as a contagion following the veins of social connection. It flowed through relatives, neighbors, and trusted confidants, traveling along pathways carved long before the crisis. Concerns voiced at dawn in one hearth reached another by dusk. Through this relentless dialogue, the community forged a singular, unified awareness of the escalating peril. This process compelled a haunting re-examination of the past. Once mundane incidents were resurrected and viewed through a distorted lens. An ancient feud, an offhand remark, or a strained alliance suddenly demanded scrutiny. In their desperation, residents mined memories for explanations. Yet memory is rarely a sterile record. It is colored by present dread. As fears sharpened, past experiences morphed, acquiring malevolent meanings they had never possessed. The shadow of suspicion engulfed more than just the accused. Friends and kin were dragged into the widening gyre. Networks that once offered support became conduits for anxiety. A connection once deemed benign now invited interrogation, forcing residents to recognize how inextricably their reputations were linked to those of their associates. Community life, once sustained by these very bonds, now rendered them liabilities under the weight of heightened scrutiny. Meanwhile, the original reports of the girls' afflictions continued to dictate public discourse. They remained the fulcrum of the crisis, their suffering perceived as a mystery demanding resolution. Each fresh accusation offered a sense of direction, however fallacious, in a landscape defined by chaos. The desperate craving for understanding compelled the villagers to embrace claims that, in saner times, would have been dismissed out of hand. This phase reveals how suspicion unspools, devouring the social fabric of Salem. Perception itself fractured. People listened, remembered, and interpreted the world through a new, darker consciousness. Physically, the village remained intact. Fields lay fallow, roads wound through the familiar landscape. Yet, internally, the terrain had shifted. The community, once anchored by routine and mutual trust, descended into an era where doubt became the primary lens through which neighbors understood one another. As suspicion metastasized, community leaders faced mounting pressure to intervene. Salem's residents viewed the accusations not as private disputes, but as a contagion threatening the communal soul. Ministers and magistrates were compelled to weigh these reports, their involvement elevating the drama from domestic unrest to a matter of urgent public concern. Village gatherings, once devoted to mundane affairs, now hummed with the pulse of these accusations. Discourse intensified before and after Sabbath services. Travelers from neighboring towns encountered a narrative already deeply entrenched. The community struggled to decipher the unfolding chaos, yet divergent opinions emerged, mirroring the fragility of the truth they sought. Religious conviction dictated the tenor of these debates. In a world where spiritual malice was a tangible reality, accusations took on an aura of plausibility that defies modern skepticism. Residents did not abandon reason. They reasoned within a paradigm where spiritual and physical realities were inextricably bound. To them, these explanations were consistent with a lifetime of faith. Simultaneously, pockets of hesitation remained. Not all shared a uniform interpretation. Many questioned the validity of specific claims or struggled to reconcile accusations with their personal knowledge of the accused. Such dissonance created friction. Residents craved clarity, yet the evidence remained fractured, rendering consensus an increasingly distant ambition. In retrospect, this period marked the moment suspicion acquired institutional gravity. Dialogue migrated from private hearths to public forums, drawing the gaze of those in power. While Salem had not yet reached the zenith of its infamy, the architecture of the catastrophe was complete. Fear, faith, and social pressure converged, creating an unstoppable momentum. The village stood on the threshold of a new phase, where mere whispers would soon crystallize into devastating, irreversible consequences. By the time initial accusations permeated public consciousness, Salem Village had transformed. Mundane interactions now carried ominous weight. A casual exchange at a threshold or a brief encounter after worship provoked intense scrutiny that would have been unthinkable months prior. Every word and expression was parsed. The community continued its outward functions, Yet residents observed one another through a lens clouded by growing dread and uncertainty. Suspicion did not ignite because the populace reached a unanimous verdict. Instead, it festered through the accumulation of individual responses. Some embraced the claims as gospel, others wavered in doubt, a few harbored silent dissent. Yet, even disagreement fueled the fire by keeping the narrative central to public discourse. The more the village debated these charges, the more they became the axis upon which daily life turned. For those named, the experience was harrowing. In such a close-knit society, reputation was the primary currency of survival. Trust was a construction of years of shared labor, prayer, and kinship. Once suspicion attached to a name, that foundation fractured. Individuals were judged not by their deeds, but by the volatile currents of rumor and fear beyond their control. The village's social fabric began to tear under unprecedented strain. On a broader scale, Salem underwent a fundamental shift in managing the inexplicable. Early inquiry focused on understanding strange phenomena. Now, it fixated on identifying culprits. This transition offered a grim sense of direction, but invited peril. Once a community tethers accusation to people rather than mysteries, it struggles to distinguish evidence from expectation. The objective shifts from uncovering the truth to validating existing fears. As this chapter closes, the birth of accusation is finalized. Names are invoked openly. Rumors have hardened into public claims. Neighbors, once fixed in familiar social roles, are now viewed with guarded wariness. Physically, the village remains intact. Fields are tilled, livestock tended, families toil, yet a malevolent change has taken root. Suspicion has infiltrated the community, perverting every relationship. What follows will not stem from a single event, but from the relentless, compounding consequences of these early accusations as they unravel the sanity of Salem Village. A heavy, rusted iron key turns slowly in a lock that shouldn't be touched, followed by the sound of a name being whispered from the shadows, a name that, once spoken, seals a fate that can never be reversed. The Salem courtroom was no grand, vaulted hall, but a utilitarian space where officials, accusers, and the accused collided. Wooden benches groaned under the weight of spectators, while judges presided from positions of stark authority. A steady stream of humanity passed through its doors, tethering their fates to the proceedings. While the setting mirrored the humble realities of colonial New England, the verdicts rendered within those walls would unleash consequences far beyond the village. The chamber crackled with a distinct, suffocating tension. Testimony rang out, detailing harrowing experiences, while restless murmurs rippled through the gallery. The scrape of boots on floorboards underscored the collective anticipation. Every sound was weighted with meaning. The room served as an altar where observation, interpretation, and judgment were laid bare before a silent, captive audience. As hearings progressed, suspicion hardened into legal form. Rumors that once fueled tavern talk were now documented as evidence. The accused stood before the bench, forced to answer allegations under the scrutiny of the law. What originated as communal gossip had evolved into official business. This transition was pivotal. Suspicion was shedding its status as mere public opinion to acquire the crushing authority of the state. To the participants, the courtroom was more than mere architecture. It was a battleground where clashing realities confronted one another. Personal trauma, religious conviction, and legal scrutiny converged in a volatile mix. Observers sought clarity, yet the process frequently birthed only deeper confusion. Within this framework, uncertainty did not evaporate. It became the very foundation upon which truth was measured, irrevocably intertwining fervent belief with the cold machinery of judgment. As proceedings advanced, a rigid protocol emerged. The accused were summoned before magistrates, interrogated amidst a chorus of witnesses and spectators. Officials demanded accounts of witchcraft, diabolical pacts, and the afflictions plaguing the accusers. Responses varied, from categorical denials to desperate attempts to rationalize suspicious circumstances. The courtroom became a crucible where competing narratives vied for legitimacy, yielding confusion instead of the clarity sought by the law. Testimony formed the bedrock of these hearings. Much rested upon claims of what was purportedly seen or felt. Statements from accusers carried immense weight, treated by officials as evidence demanding immediate action. Witnesses recounted spectral encounters and supernatural phenomena, presenting accounts that defied physical verification. Lacking tangible proof, the court relied upon these declarations to construct its version of events. A defining feature of the Salem proceedings was the acceptance of spectral evidence. Accusers testified that the apparition of the accused had materialized to inflict torment, experiences invisible to all but the claimant. Within the prevailing theological framework, officials deemed this evidence credible. The concept that malevolent forces operated through human vessels remained a terrifyingly plausible reality for those deeply immersed in a spiritual worldview. This reliance on the invisible birthed an impossible dilemma. How could the accused refute a charge based on experiences beyond human observation? An individual might protest their innocence, yet the accusation was anchored in an inaccessible realm. Judges struggled to reconcile these testimonies with their legal mandate. Their rulings were grim attempts to interpret evidence through a distorted lens, grappling with a reality that defied conventional logic. To modern eyes, this courtroom appears as a landscape where incompatible standards of truth collided. Personal trauma, religious fervor, and direct observation occupied the same legal domain. Participants believed they were excavating the truth, yet their methodologies only deepened the ambiguity. The court became an institution where fear and conviction were codified into law. Justice marched forward, but its foundations remained inextricably bound to the very uncertainties that had ignited the crisis. The magistrates presiding over Salem saw no looming historical controversy. They viewed themselves as guardians of communal safety and spiritual order. Their mandate was to weigh testimony and render judgment. Yet, the nature of these cases, rooted in the invisible and the deeply personal, defied the standards of ordinary law. They were tasked with judging the intangible, a challenge that rendered every proceeding fraught with peril. Examinations were grueling, forensic dissections of the human spirit. Magistrates probed for inconsistencies, relentlessly mapping the connections between claims. Sessions stretched into agonizing hours as spectators watched with bated breath, desperate for a truth that remained elusive. Each answer, rather than resolving the chaos, often birthed new complexities, widening the chasm of uncertainty. The conduct of the accusers exerted a magnetic pull on the proceedings. When they collapsed or writhed in apparent agony, their distress was codified as evidence. That the presence of the accused allegedly triggered such trauma served as immediate, visceral confirmation of guilt. For many in the chamber, these displays were impossible to ignore. They became the bedrock of the court's evolving narrative. For the accused, the courtroom was a trap. Denials proved futile, for protests of innocence were themselves filtered through the lens of suspicion. Defendants faced inquiries regarding spectral actions that left no physical trace, rendering a logical defense impossible. Proving one's innocence was a Sisyphean task. How does one disprove the invisible? As the trials multiplied, the legal machinery developed a terrifying momentum. Each ruling set a precedent, shackling future proceedings to past judgments. The court transformed raw fear into institutional procedure, offering the facade of authority over a foundation of irreconcilable belief. Judgment and ambiguity marched in lockstep, an unholy alliance that sustained the machinery of the trials even as the truth dissolved into shadow. As cases inundated the legal system, the courtroom became an insatiable engine. Every new accusation mandated hearings, layering testimony upon testimony. Officials labored to synthesize a deluge of information from disparate sources, seeking patterns and connections amidst the rising tide. What commenced as a localized spark had matured into a sprawling legal enterprise, engulfing the community in its reach. The court leaned heavily on documentation. Clerks transcribed every deposition, ruling, and detail, imposing a rigid structure upon the chaos. Names, dates, and allegations were etched onto parchment, creating a formal chronicle of the unfolding crisis. Yet, documentation is not synonymous with veracity. A written record preserves a claim, but it cannot validate it. The chasm between archival record and absolute truth remained wide. Beyond the courtroom, Salem watched with bated breath. News of proceedings rippled through the village and its neighbors, fueling intense speculation. A symbiotic cycle emerged. Legal decisions molded public opinion, and that consensus, in turn, sustained the momentum of the trials. The courtroom and the community became inseparable gears in a single, accelerating mechanism. As this cycle tightened, the court's authority lent legitimacy to allegations that might otherwise have languished in doubt. The public instinctively equated formal proceedings with the pursuit of truth. The existence of examinations and official dossiers fostered a false confidence that definitive conclusions were within reach, even as the court weighed claims fundamentally impossible to verify. This era exposes a shift in the nature of belief. Fears once confined to private discourse were now processed by institutions empowered to issue binding decrees. The court did not invent the suspicion permeating Salem, but it provided the crucible in which those suspicions were forged into official judgment. As hearings multiplied, judicial reasoning became saturated with uncertainty. Faith, authority, and testimony fused, producing outcomes that would carve a permanent, jagged scar into Salem's history. As the trials endured, the courtroom became the nexus of Salem. Decisions rendered within those walls rippled outward, dictating the fate of families and the collective future of the village. It stood as a convergence point for private dread, public anxiety, and institutional power, a theater where the consequences of every ruling reverberated across the region. The court's influence stemmed from its capacity to transmute hearsay into official conclusion. A rumor traded in the street remained ephemeral. A statement captured in court gained gravitas. By formalizing allegations, the process imposed a structure on chaos. Yet, structure provided no shield against error. The court weighed evidence that often defied physical proof, leaving the veracity of its findings perpetually in shadow. This paradox defined the Salem trials. Participants pursued truth using the flawed instruments of their era: religious fervor, reputation, and spectral testimony. In its attempt to excise uncertainty, the court became entangled within it. Judgments were crafted not merely from observable fact, but from a bedrock of belief in unseen forces, a reality as tangible to the jurors as it was invisible to the eye. For the accused, the machinery of justice was relentless. Once ensnared, an individual faced a system distorted by prejudice. Defending against tangible accusations is arduous. Refuting the spectral is impossible. Many defendants were paralyzed, forced to confront charges predicated entirely upon the subjective, uncorroborated experiences of others. In retrospect, the courtroom served as the crucible where uncertainty masqueraded as law. Judges sought answers, witnesses offered declarations, and clerks codified the results. Yet, beneath the formal veneer, fundamental questions regarding evidence and belief remained unanswered. Salem's legal apparatus operated with chilling gravity, yet it remained shackled to a culture haunted by unseen dangers. Here, suspicion was stripped of its status as mere rumor and forged into a grim, legal reality. The gavel falls, but it doesn't just decide a verdict, it seals a tomb. The court thinks they are uncovering the truth, but they are only feeding the fire. And as the ink dries on the death warrants, you have to wonder, who will be left to judge the judges? The next part is coming in just 48 hours.